All right, everybody, thanks so much for joining us for another Overt webinar. Today, we're talking Google's Core Web Vitals. We're going to talk to you about why it's important and a whole bunch of other things related to the topic. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Christopher Fasano. I'm the Chief Growth Officer, at Overt. And so what we're going to do today, I'm joined by Dan O'Leary. I'm going to introduce him in a second. I'm also trying to buy another minute or so as people are coming in and joining us on streams. We all know in the world of business today that your website is more than a face. It actually serves a vital, component, is a vital component of your business. It's very functional, and it has a certain set of standards and vitals that it should, live up to and have. And we always want to make sure we're improving our website and have it to a level where it's performing correctly. And what we'll talk about today is that, in regard with Google, that it's going to place you in a good situation for people to find you, that you're going to be visible and ultimately going to get traffic to come and either convert on your service or your products that live there. So we're going to go through an agenda that I'll have Dan introduce in a second, and we're going to walk you through this. I just wanted to remind everybody here that about 10 to 14 days after this webinar, we have a roundtable, and you're going to get an email to remind you. And this isn't the final reminder. And what's great about the roundtable is the roundtable is intended to be a sort of open forum. So what we'll do at the end of this, Dan will talk about this, is give you a little homework assignment, something for you to go back and do, look at your website, and then you can bring back the information that you found, and we'll sit down together and we'll have an open dialogue, and you'll be able to ask our experts questions that you found or some things that were raised, and we'll be able to have a more interactive dialogue. Right now, you can submit some questions where we're streaming. You can just submit them there, and as they come in, if they're relevant to the actual slide, I'll try to get it in. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end to answer your questions. But please make sure you submit your questions. And again, if you forget to ask or you come up with a question later on, you can bring them to the roundtable, or you can email Dan and myself. We'll put our email addresses up. So I'm going to introduce Dan O'Leary, who's sitting to my right, although it looks like I'm pointing to the left on this screen. Dan O'Leary is a senior SEO strategist and specialist here at Overit, and he's really the true subject matter expert for today's topic. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Dan is going to go through the agenda and what we should expect from today's webinar, and we'll walk through from there. So Dan, take it away.
Chris, thanks for joining us today and guiding this conversation. Core Web Vitals is a topic, that has been a point of emphasis at Overit Media with our clients and our strategies for the last 3 to 6 months. But it's still a topic that not everyone is maybe familiar with. But as you emphasize, this is your website performance is becoming more and more integrated into brand and brand identity and the associations that your potential customers and users are going to have with your website. So today we really hope to give you guys some good information and then again actionable next steps that you can take to look at and kind of self-audit your website, the pages on your website, and start to identify meaningful opportunities for improvement that are going to improve user experience and conversion rates generally across the board, regardless of your particular channels that you leverage. So let's pull up the presentation, and the first thing we'll do is we'll just run through a quick agenda. We've got an ambitious itinerary on our plate, but we want to give a general idea of who is this presentation for in terms of what your roles at your organizations might be and the types of websites that this would be an ideal fit for. We are going to jump after that right into it. What are Core Web Vitals and why are they important? What are they specifically measuring and how are these measurements benchmarked? We're going to give you specific tools and platforms that you can use to analyze Core Web Vitals and associated web development metrics and components. We're going to identify and give you common issues to solve for. And then pulling it back, we're actually going to tell you, what can't automated tools tell you? And this will kind of guide us into a conversation about how SEOs and digital marketers work with web development teams or web development professionals. We'll give you some basic tips and tricks and suggestions towards the end. And again, we're going to leave you with actionable next steps, which ideally will lead us into that roundtable in about 10 to 14 days' time. As Chris said, we'll kind of give you a little bit of a homework assignment, if you will, so that you have specific issues or topics that you can bring to discuss for your website in particular at that roundtable. All right. So who is this for? Ideally, this is meant for a generalized audience. I would say the typical person who should be watching this is, I'm a small business owner and I wear all the hats in the business, right? I'm the owner, the operator, the head marketing person, the person who does social media. If you wear a variety of hats, this is definitely going to be geared towards you. Any person who is a marketing manager or officer, maybe you're not the business owner, but you work in an organization and your primary responsibilities are marketing. And particularly if you're a digital marketing professional, this would be a good fit for you. This is not necessarily catered towards web developers or SEOs. Some of this material may, for highly seasoned web developers, seem like a little remedial perhaps. Not to say that web developers or SEOs won't find something meaningful for it, but again, this is we tried to cater this towards a layman's audience, if you will, people who need to know this material and understand it, but necessarily don't come from a professional web development background. In terms of websites, it's really all websites, B2C, B2B. You could be a nonprofit or an organization. If you leverage Google search, or particularly organic search as a channel, then this is going to be relevant to you. If you have a website that receives any significant percentage of traffic from your mobile device users, I would say 25% or more of your traffic comes from mobile or handheld devices, then this is going to be something relevant to you. If you have image or multimedia heavy websites, so you're leveraging pictures or video perhaps, it could even these days, audio and podcasts is becoming more and more popular, right? Anything that we would term multimedia heavy, those types of websites, this is going to be relevant to you. And task completion websites. Most businesses and organizations have websites, yes, to be contact information, to provide information about the organization, but they serve also very specific functions. So if you're trying to get people to fill out forms or provide contact information, if you want them to add things to shopping carts and check out, if you want them to download particular assets, each website has its own particular set of tasks that are associated with it. All right. So if you have a task completion oriented website, then this is going to be relevant to you. All right. So let's talk about just what are these core web vitals, right? They are effectively page load performance metrics. And what that means is we're talking about page load speed. Yes, but there's other components, particularly after a page even loads. It's interactivity levels, how interactive it is, and whether or not it's what we call visually stable, whether the page kind of skips across the screen as it loads. So we emphasize, again, this is mobile, tends to emphasize mobile performance. One thing you should understand as an audience is that Google about 2 or 3 years ago switched away from crawling as a desktop separately from mobile devices. They used to have two types of user agents, as I called it, and they'd crawl your website like as a desktop would appear for the screen sizes, and then they had a separate bot that was called like Google Smartphone, and it would look at your website as like a mobile phone would render it. They've now merged those two, and there really is only what they call mobile first indexing. So even if your website receives significant levels of desktop traffic, like most of our people are B2B, they're sitting at their offices on their computers, and that's where they visit their website, it ironically doesn't matter anymore. Like your mobile performance is how Google is basically crawling and discovering your website, and their algorithms are effectively kind of judging you on how fast your website loads in mobile devices in particular. So they give you data about both how you're faring for mobile and desktop, but we almost always emphasize, particularly for most of our clients that again do see significant levels from mobile traffic, that you want to nail down your mobile speed. And typically if you're solving for a good mobile performance, your desktop performance is going to come along part and parcel with it, right? So there's no need to kind of separate the two, even though Google will sometimes present the data in two different ways. So Core Web Vitals was introduced in summer of 2020, so it's well over a year old, but it wasn't fully integrated into Google search ranking algorithms until this summer. So they announced this like last summer, and they basically released a whole bunch of internal documentation and research alongside the announcement of We are going to be emphasizing in what Google calls their ecosystem, because Google has many different products. We're emphasizing Google Search, but we're going to talk a little bit about like, well, how does Chrome come into play? Chrome is the world's most widely used web browser, and it's a product and service that's also owned by Google. Typically, those two departments or aspects of the company don't necessarily always integrate or work with one another, but this is a particular area where Google Search has often piggybacked on the back of the Google Chromium or Google Chrome team, okay? So we're going to look in a little bit as to what they are specifically measuring, but they are they're things that they measure specifically and then benchmark against all other websites, but particularly in your vertical. So why are Core Web Vitals important? Why is Google emphasizing this? This is a graph that I took literally from the blog post where Google first announced that they were going to be introducing and eventually using these metrics. And this comes from the Google Chromium team and their own internal research. So Google Chrome is, again, the most widely used browser. They have access to like all the session level data, millions and millions, if not billions at this point, of like independent web page loads. And what they have found time and time again is like this kind of graph shape that depicts the relationship between if there's any delays in how your page loads, as the delay grows, how many users are going to abandon, they're going to leave before the page can fully load, and we call that site abandonment, right? So you can see in this particular graph here that very quickly 50% of the users are gone like that. If there's anything after we're gonna see, it's typically around 2.5 to 4 seconds. That's it. If you have more than 4-second delay in terms of like users can see that things are now loading on their device for your web page. If it's longer than that, they're going to abandon. So very quickly, 50% of users just drop right off. And then the curve starts to slow and smooth out a little bit, but you can see eventually it reaches like there's no users left, right? So eventually all users will drop off if the delays are that long. This also comes directly from the blog post. I almost never want to like read stuff right off a screen, but this was one slide where I was like, I don't think I can like say it any better than they did. So Google basically, they say, we analyzed millions of page impressions to understand how these metrics affect users. And we found that when a site meets our thresholds that we're going to identify, they are 24% less likely to abandon page loads by leaving the page before any of the content is loaded. And then they looked at other types of specific websites, news and shopping sites, sites whose businesses depend again on what we talked about, task completion, and they found similar numbers. 22% less abandonment for news sites, 24% less abandonment for shopping sites. We know, Chris, we talk for many of our clients about shopping cart abandonment, right? Mm-hmm. It's a pervasive problem in like e-commerce. And you're also like, I think this is right up your alley because you're our growth strategist, and we've talked internally, like there's many different ways to like grow your business. One way to grow your business is obviously to acquire like new visibility in like new areas, right? Go where your customers or ideal customers are, but eventually you reach market saturation, right? You can't put in any more new leads up at the top. So this is an area of opportunity, and this is why Google really emphasizes this. Like you can get 20% lifts in common KPIs for engagement and conversion when the sites meet these thresholds. So really this comes down to like reason number one we want to emphasize this is you need to maximize all your existing clicks. Very, very often business owners are like, I need more rankings, I need more clicks. And when we kind of look at the data, we often say, all right, well, again, we can improve the visibility to a certain degree, but your core business challenge, particularly for this particular channel, might actually be more engagement oriented. Once they get to the site, what happens next, right? If we keep putting in users up at the top to an unsatisfactory website that doesn't load, right, and they get frustrated, then no amount of extra budget or sharp tactics is really fundamentally going to lead to more revenue, right? So we're trying to squeeze more juice from the same oranges. And again, this comes from Google's data for Chrome. That's not necessarily always benchmarked to organic search, right? So I'm an SEO strategist. I'm emphasizing and presenting this in part because I believe it's important for people who need organic search traffic to understand how this works. But Google, at the Chrome level, a visit is a visit to them. So this is going to also improve your referral traffic, your paid performance, your social media traffic, your direct visits, whatever. So you can maximize existing clicks and traffic across all of your channels, not just Google search, right? Reason number two, if you do use Google search, if it's an important channel for you, particularly for driving awareness, it's a search ranking factor now. Google has, the number often thrown out is like 200 distinct ranking factors. It's kind of an outdated way of thinking of it, but Google's algorithms are very, very complex. They're very context specific, but they integrate a lot of different data points, and this is now one of them. And I'll emphasize, in competitive verticals, this matters more, right? All things being equal, if you have 2 or 3 websites that have similar levels of visibility, right? This is your website and 2 of your top competitors, and users are clicking on it, and your competitors have faster loading sites that are more satisfactory, they're going to get more ROI out of their current visibility than you are.
Can I just make a point on that? I like to offer the sort of the lay voice to this, because this is obviously not my area of expertise, the nuts and bolts. But we all think about Google is greedy, right? They want to maximize. They want you to be an authority, because when you're an authority, then that helps them out for people to be viewing you and coming to you and doing that. So, like with Dan, what you're saying is that Google is now telling us this is important. And they're telling us it's important for a reason. So if we can either ignore it, or we can work to get it right. And I think the point Dan just made is really important, that we can work really hard, in a vertical especially, to do all these things right. And we might have 6 others that are doing all those things right. So now we need one more thing to separate us from the pack that's really gonna push us up and give Google a reason to say, no, not those 5. This one here is in fact the most authoritative in this regard, so we're gonna give it that little extra. And so this is what that will do. And I think if Google's really trying to tell us something, I think you're making the point with the carrot and the stick on the next point there, Dan. We should listen to this and try to address it, because they wouldn't just say this and make it a point of emphasis unless they're really, really gonna use it to differentiate from a very, very crowded search landscape.
Yeah, that's excellent how you phrased it and kind of reframed it, that Google is telling us something. And I've been working in search engine optimization specifically for over a decade now, which for some SEOs is like a drop in the bucket, but for some others kind of represents, at least to have a little bit of a historical perspective. And in those 10 years, I can tell you that, they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? That there's certain patterns that you can kind of identify. And I'm gonna give 2 very specific examples from the past that sort of is like giving me where I believe this is going. The 2 examples are mobile-friendly websites. Almost all websites now use what we call responsive design, meaning that you basically have like one design to your website, and your CSS, your style sheets are figure out based off of the size of the device how it's going to like retile, as they call it. 10 years ago, or not even 10 years ago, 7 years ago, some people still had those like m.dot versions of their website, m.example.com, and you had a mobile version of your website, and you had a desktop version. And Google said, we don't want you to use those m.dots anymore. Just use responsive design. That was first a suggestion. Now, look at Google search results for your vertical, any vertical. You will not find, or rarely ever find, a non-responsive, non-mobile friendly website in a Google search result. And if you're using Chrome and you do find it, they actually put a little icon or badge that says like not mobile friendly. Right? So Google Chrome, again, I say that they're often independent of one another. Google Chrome team is basically flagging search results in Chrome that's like, this isn't mobile friendly. You may not enjoy this. The second example is HTTPS, right? Secure websites, security certificates. It was first again suggested by Google, hey, we want you to move for the benefit of our users from HTTP, which is not secure, to HTTPS, particularly if you're doing things like collecting information about your users, right? So again, if you have a task completion website and you're storing emails or phone numbers or what have you, like, again, go to search results and point to find me a non-HTTPS website. And again, if you do, it's gonna have like that unlocked warning sign from Google Chrome in particular. Maybe other web browsers don't display that. I know Safari shows some kind of similar sort of warnings. I believe Firefox does as well. In both of those examples, Google basically suggested, hey, get in front of this, and if you do it, we will reward you with more visibility. And then eventually it became, this is now actually kind of basically a de facto like requirement. It's a minimum ante to even appear in our search results. And in fact, if you go to Google Search Console, they have a new tab that's called Page Experience Signals. And the 3 things that are in there are you mobile friendly? Check. Are you HTTPS secure? Check. And what's the newest one that they've added in there? How do your core web vitals look? So that by the very grouping of the 2 other things that they're like putting it into Search Console, I can, again, it's like, well, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I've seen this pattern before. So why we're trying to get in front of this is we want to remind our audience, you have basically 12 to 18, maybe 24 months before, if you're not in front of this, you're going to be replaced by websites that took this initiative and now offer satisfactory, fast, compelling web speeds. And again, content always rules. If you have the best answer, Google's going to show typically your things. But who's the best answer? In very competitive verticals, tiebreakers are going to start being used, all right? So what's suggested now, typically, historically, could just be a mandate tomorrow, or again, a minimum ante, I would say, to even be in the search results. So what are they measuring? Let's really dive into this, because I've described them as like, well, is it speed? Is it load performance? They are 3 very specific things that through Google's Chrome research that they identified, here are the things that basically frustrate users that you need to solve for. One is a web page needs to be fast loading. And the metric for this is called largest contentful paint. Some people call it largest content paint, or LCP, right? And this is basically what is the largest thing that's visible on your screen that loads immediately. We call that above the fold content, right? It's not the stuff that's below that you have to scroll, it's what's immediately going to load on your page. That's largest content paint. This is measured in seconds, all right? So Google basically identifies if you can get your web page to load the largest element on screen in 2.5 seconds or faster, they say that you have a good LCP performance. If you're between 2.5 and 4 seconds, you're in that needs improvement area. And if you're over 4 seconds, you can see they say that's poor. 4 seconds or beyond, they do not recognize that as a satisfactory experience, and right now they're kind of prodding you with the carrot, eventually the stick, make this faster, all right? So largest content paint is a pure speed metric, and it's measured in seconds. There is another metric that is an interactivity metric, and it's called first input delay. And basically the best way to describe this is, say I am filling out a form, or say you have an interactive website and I need to click on things and do things and push buttons. There's always a slight lag between when I actually click on something and when the browser like shows me, oh yeah, you clicked. It gives you an indication, a visual indication that it's responding to your touch or your interaction with it. Now that lag is not in seconds, it's in milliseconds, right? So this goes into, you're a neuroscientist, so I know that you know about like, what can happen in 100 milliseconds, right? So if the lag is under 100 milliseconds, from what I understand, you could correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of reaching the threshold where it's like not really perceptible to the human eye, right? You're reaching that limit where it's like...
It is. And you know what's interesting, Dan, is that like, so that is not, those are 2 separate things. So you could have the fastest site load, but you can also have a poor metric here.
Yes.
So I think that's important for people to understand, is that these are separate things. You know, you can be the quickest loading website. I get there, and then I click, and then there's a delay. And so what they're saying here is that we want this to be like a subconscious thing. You shouldn't even know you clicked on something.
It's
it
almost
just
imperceptible,
be there, right?
yeah.
Okay, all right, cool.
So if you're under 100 milliseconds, it's basically imperceptible, and the experience is very satisfactory. I click, I can see what I'm doing is like leading to meaningful interaction and changes on the web page, right? Between 100 and 300 milliseconds, it starts to now become maybe like a little bit more noticeable, right? It's a little laggy. That's the needs improvement zone. Anything beyond 300 milliseconds, and again, what's 300 milliseconds? it's that, right? It's not even... It's fractions and fractions of a second. But anything beyond 300 milliseconds, then the human eye and the psychology of it, again, is it gets frustrating. It's the visual equivalent of hearing feedback. Right? Yep. You're on a conference call and you're like, where's that echo coming from? It drives people nuts. Yep. The same thing happens when they're trying to interact. I'm clicking on something, or I'm typing, and I don't see the letters that I'm typing in the time that I'm typing, right? So interactivity is very important. And then the last one is what they call a visual stability metric, okay? They call call it cumulative layout shift. This is not measured in time. It's actually measured as like a decimal or a ratio, all right? And the best way I can describe it is like in our graphic there, you can see the person's looking at cats, right? Cats and dogs make up about 50% of all web traffic in my experience, particularly on
Is that real?
I made that up, but right, based on current content
you know what?
trends,
I would believe that, though.
One would assume
definitely-
like at any given time, people are looking at cats
I would
or
definitely
dogs,
believe
right?
that to be true.
Your web page is loading and you want to click or do something on the web page, but then at the last second, and in my experience, this is often like banner ads. It's whatever is like the last thing to kind of load on the page. If it's particularly large or it wasn't defined, we'll talk about like defining your image attributes, the size and specs of them. Sometimes as the page loads in real time, the last thing kind of pushes the things down. So you can see in the graphic like, oh, an annoying banner ad popped up right at the end, and I was going to click on the cute cat, but now I'm not clicking on the cat, I'm clicking on something else. So if you're trying to click on a link, right, again, like, oh, click this to read more or to learn more or to go to a new destination on the website, and at the last second, it like skips or shifts. So this is measured in a decimal or percentage, and the best way I can describe it is like, all right, well, if your screen size is 1,000 pixels wide or long or what have you, and the amount that it skips is 100 pixels, well, 100 out of 1,000 is like 1/10, right? So they have 0.1, you can have like 10% pixel skip, and it won't be that bad. They'll still say like, that's pretty good. If between 0.1 and 0.25, and now that represents like a 25% screen shift, right? That's more significant. That's going to be needs improvement. Anything above 0.25, it's just so significantly that they say this isn't visually stable. And again, it's not necessarily a pure like, is it fast? And it's not an interactivity metric. It's when I go to interact or consume the content, will what I'm even looking at still be in the same destination? Particularly as you scroll. As new things load on the page, the browser needs to sometimes like re-render the page. And this is where sometimes these things have these like skipping effects.
You know what? Like, they're not really leaving a lot of leeway here, Google. You know, it's like you need to have it load in 2 seconds. You can't even... when you press something and like you said, a form, it just needs to appear. And then finally, like, you get a little bit of lag on that. So it's very strict and it's very quick, and it's trying to optimize for our starved attention economy that we're in, where people do not have the patience. They expect to get somewhere, click on something, just it happen. And it just tells you what they're trying to do and where they're trying to get everybody. You know, there's not a lot of leeway in that scale. I mean, if I'm reading that right now, I mean, milliseconds is not even an existing time frame. You know,
when I was first digesting this, I was like, oh, it's just 3 things. But it's like, it so speaks again to like, well, those are 3 different areas entirely, right?
Yeah.
And like, Google they are asking like a lot.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah,
because it's not their prior page speed metrics, and we'll kind of like go over like a typical report that you might see from their tools in a little bit. They used to just kind of just really emphasize like make it load fast. But this new part of like, well, actually, the more we research this, interactivity matters just as much more.
Right, that makes sense.
Right,
I just don't want to get somewhere fast. I want to, when I get there, be able to do what I want to do without having to think about it. And especially we know in services where people need answers quickly. If I'm waiting and I feel frustrating, I also think the psychological component to this is that it gives you a sense that the business knows what they're doing and they're on top of it, right? If it's not fast and it's slow, it might feel uneasy about actually navigating through that. So Google might penalize them, but the customer, might bail on them and say, forget it, I don't even want to bother.
Yeah, I mean, any technology system you bring into your business, whether it's automated phone systems or your website, there's always going to be a level of like, if it doesn't work, it's very frustrating for the customer, and they always will associate it for almost forever with your brand or your experience, right? These raw metrics, again, so these are very specific benchmarks that they're tangible, right? You can literally time them with the stopwatch. For the LCP, the first input delay is a little bit faster time frames, but they're still measured in time, right? And then the CLS is just a decimal or like a ratio percentage of like how much did it skip on a pixel by pixel like basis. They take these raw metrics, and then what they do is they also translate it to scores on a 100-point scale, right? So if you scored like 3.5 seconds on your LCP, 8. They still like take that 3.5, but they're going to translate it to like you scored, you know, kind of like when you're in school. Like what did you get on a 100-point scale test? And then they take all 3 of those scores and they combine them into a composite page speed score. The weights are a little bit different. I will tell you that LCP and first input delay, they are more heavily weighted than cumulative layout shift. They're not like all 3 are equal. When they do combine them into a composite score, they have their various weights, and definitely LCP and FID, the first input delay, are the most important ones to emphasize, all right? And then these scores are measured and they're benchmarked on a page-by-page basis. And this is really important to understand. Google ranks pages. They don't rank websites. This is a very common misunderstanding in like SEO in general. Like, oh, why doesn't my website rank? The question you should be asking is like, do you have a particular page that you believe should be ranking for it? So what this means is like, say your homepage is like blazing fast, but your service pages or your main categories, if you sell products, right? If those pages are slow and that's where users are coming in or where they're navigating to, then it doesn't really matter how the homepage performance was. So this is like a double-edged sword because you can really focus on the pages that drive the most meaningful business metrics for you first. Right? If you don't have the resources to just improve your core web vitals all across the board, I have a 1,000-page website, right? We know that like 80% of the business is typically generated by like 20% of the things, right? So we identify the top 20% of pages, your homepage, your main top level service categories. Maybe it might be a high performing blog post, things like that, right? But we can identify what those are and prioritize them accordingly. And every site is gonna see some variation in page speed scores from page to page. And even if you take the same page and run it through the tools, we've seen this, our developers are like, I tested, I get a 33. I click the same button, I get a 35. Why the 2-point difference? There's always actually going to be real world variables that you can't control for, and we'll talk about those. The actual like, well, is your user on a 3G phone connection, or are they on a 4G, a 5G? Are they in a rural area, or are they in like downtown Manhattan, right? Real life things that basically are independent of your website, but are how the internet work and how it delivers through mobile networks can impact your score. So even when you're testing the same page, you may see some slight variation.
So the score is not an indicator of your home page when that score shows.
Unless you're testing specifically the homepage.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
And I recommend that's where you start. For almost all websites, your homepage.
But it can be different though, is the point. Like if someone starts with their homepage, and they're like, oh, that's awesome. I can be done with this.
No, you're going to want to sample
like
a few
that
more
would
pages.
be something I would do. I would say, oh, I got a great score on my page, but I most likely do my homepage, and then I leave. But content exists differently on different pages. You might have a lot more. It could be heavier. It could be different. So it's going to affect it. So
certainly.
Okay, but does it take into account? It says it takes it into account the other pages. It doesn't. So it's purely looking at that
page to page.
Okay.
Each page is an island unto itself.
Okay.
So again, you can really, if you look at your analytics and say, if I've audited like 3 to 5 page types, right? Most websites have page types or templates. Like all your categories look alike. Your subcategories are, again, from a web development standpoint, you're using the same style sheets, right? They look and feel the same way because they're equivalent level pages. This is my blue widgets. This is my red widgets. This is my green widgets, right? All of those. So I recommend you kind of audit by like page type and think of it at like a template level. The specific URL, the specific page is kind of arbitrary, right? But you do need to go beyond just your home page. And, obviously start there. It's always where you want to start, but don't think that, oh, if my home page is like blazing fast, that you're done, right?
Okay.
This isn't like a checklist, right? Let's talk a little bit about the benchmarking, because this is the most confusing part. It confused me a little bit, and I really had to wrap my head around how does this grade scoring work. So one thing I want to emphasize is Google's grading and benchmarking does not follow like what we would call like a bell curve. So if any of in our audience were math majors or you took that statistics class in college, here's your classic bell curve. And the thing to know about a bell curve is that there's typically low variability in the data, right? Most of the data points fall within one standard deviation on the left or right of the median, right? So 68% of the data or the things that you're looking at are in what we call that chunky middle. And then another 26% are in the next standard deviations, right? And as you get farther out, you're talking about only 3% of the potential data, 0.1% of the data, right? It's smooth, it's uniform, but most things are like right in the middle. Most things are average. Google's benchmarking isn't a bell curve. This is a graph that I grabbed from Google's documentation. And you can't, I wish we could zoom in a little bit more, but the key thing to understand about this is that, one, the shape of the graph is different. This is what we call a logarithmic or log normal curve. And this is, there's higher data point variation that you're going to find in a bell curve, particularly as you get to like the high ends, the tails as we call them. I think the math term is asymptote. It approaches infinity sort of and never quite reaches it. In this type of grading curve, what you have is if they say that you score 50 out of 100 on their tool, what they mean is that you're actually at the 75th percentile performance, meaning the top 25% of all the page loads that they've encountered. Now, that's really counterintuitive. You're like 50 out of 100. First of all, most people from their school experience would think like that's an F.
Oh, man.
I failed, right? And even if you're thinking 50 out of 100, all right, it's median, it's purely average, right? That's why it's 50 out of 100. It's actually not. Google's very curve of how they define where these data points lie are kind of like default. So if you had, I was joking with you yesterday, if you had like that college class where like one kid reset the curve, you know, the professor graded on a curve, right? Well, that's what's happening here, right? The very highest, best performing websites and the very worst performing websites on the other end are sort of defining the ends, and most people fall somewhere else on that curve, okay? So this is kind of like, I like this table to really communicate. If you score a 90, which Google kind of, that's only when they start giving you a green color, that's actually the 92nd percentile. And in our experience, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You have a blazing, that page at least, again, page by page. Maybe other pages don't have that. But for that particular page, that's blazing fast, 90 out of 100.
I wish in college they graded like this.
Yeah, right.
25 for the average, 50 is very good.
If you scored a 50 out of 100, that's again the 75th percentile, and I would say that's very good. In our experience, again, especially if you test a lot of these in the wild, and this is where we've been doing this for 3 to 6 months now with our client base top to bottom, 25 to 30 is often a very average score. That's what I would say is actually
we've been seeing a lot of those numbers, like 28, 29, right? Yeah,
and that's average. And you've got to score. You have to score below a 20 in my mind for you to truly be, I would say, in the bottom half of websites. But again, it's like not intuitive. It's often, I think, counterintuitive for most people's experience. Like they don't understand like logarithmic growth. Like they understand geometric growth, right? Or algebraic growth. But this kind of log curve like throws them for a loop, right? Another key thing to take away is like once you reach the high end or the low end, it's really harder and harder to move in those directions any further. Once you get to a page about a 90 to 100, the amount of effort it takes you to move the needle, it becomes really fast. Like I could put 6 extra hours of work and I'm going to squeeze out a half of a millisecond extra performance. You will eventually hit that wall of just diminishing returns. So there's a sweet spot. Like if you're at a 20 or a 30, it's very easy to get you to a 40 or 50, right? Easy. But if you're at a 90, up can only go so much up. On the flip side, it's actually, in my experience, really hard to score below a 10. You don't often see those. And if you do score below a 10, it's like, wow. What Google is saying is like, you, my friend, are among the worst of the worst.
You got to do some stuff.
You have to improve this. Yeah, exactly. So like the one thing I don't like about Google's kind of the way they present things visually, like the visual vocabulary, they do poor, needs improvement, and then good. And good is like, again, it's a 90, which we just said in the real world, in the wild, that's like fantastic, right? They're not using any intermediary colors. So bear with me. This is Dan O'Leary's color scale, right? This is not what Google presents. But if I were to present a more intuitive color scale and try to, again, communicate this with clients or our audience members today, let's reset our relative competitive performance thresholds and give them a little bit better shading, because there's different colors besides just red, yellow, green, right? There's yellow, green, there's red, orange, right? So you can kind of see like 10, poor, 15, 25, 30, you're going into the needs improvement average. Once you actually get to a 50, you're probably good. 70, very good. 90 is fantastic, right? If you're scoring 90s, you probably don't need to address anything unless you really just want to go above and beyond, right? So understanding that less than intuitive benchmarking really helps set expectations, because one thing I don't want is people to come out of this, go to the tool I'm going to tell you to run your homepage through, and then there's like sticker shock, like, oh my God, the sky is falling, right? You need to have proper expectations for what those scores typically actually look like. And again, when a page has a very low score, even very basic remediation can jump the score quite a bit. A 20 can become a 40. As you move up the scoring scale, though, it takes more and more effort to see smaller point gains, right? So Google kind of gave some examples. They're like, if you were at a 96 and you wanted to move to a 99, a 3-point lift, that would take the same number of, let's say we're doing this for LCP, you would need to shave the same number of milliseconds saved. You would get the same point jump for those number of milliseconds if you were at a 90 trying to go to a 96. So that's a 6-point lift. Or if you're at an 80 trying to go to a 92, that's a 12-point lift. As you slide down the scale, the same number of milliseconds saved represents
a bigger jump.
Bigger jumps, right? So in terms of like, well, how do you prioritize? How do you create strategies and plans for attacking this? You have to be realistic about what your resources and budgets are and who you have, like in terms of like, do you have a web developer, right? Because eventually you will have diminishing returns, and even like the data analyst, the strategist in me is going to say, you've maximized this for now, right? Until budget is no question, then you should probably stop, because you're not going to be able to squeeze any more juice out of that particular orange. What do they say though? Like, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you, right? So one thing I also want you to understand is like when they're creating these like log curves, that's kind of benchmarked to all Chrome page loads that Google can see for like the last 10 years, right? We're talking about millions and billions of websites and page loads. But the most important benchmarks are actually against your specific local competition. If you're a national brand, I guess it's like your national competition. But most of over its clients, we have like local or regional demographics and customer bases and competitors. So you don't need to outrun the bear, you just need to outrun everyone else. In some verticals or geos, you may not need a 70 out of 100. Again, a 35 out of 100 may be more than sufficient to beat the rest. So it's very important to like not only like test yourself, but again, in terms of, well, what does this mean? Where's the actionable part for strategy development in terms of like competitive advantages, disadvantages? You need to benchmark against your actual local competition. So auditing this competition, again, is going to give you a sense of like context, proper context, not just what a tool spits out, do this. And it's going to inform your ROI, like how much money can I put in for inputs and how much gains am I going to get for outputs.
And someone just asked, or basically made a comment, so I can do this for my competitors? And the answer is yes. And Dan is going to go through it at the end a little. That's part of the homework assignment. And then, definitely. And like what Dan is mentioning here is that's part of the analysis here. It's not just how you're doing, it's how they're doing. Because like Dan said, it's an input game. We have a lot of things to do. There's minimum budgets. So if we have a score and that score is sufficient relative to competition, then we might make the determination, you know what, at this point, you guys are good. Let's not put all this effort in here because we're already outrunning everybody else. Whereas let's say we're doing pretty well, but everyone's doing better, then we're going to have to try to squeeze more out of that orange. So it is very important to do not only look in the mirror at yourself, but look outside to the left and the right as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about what are specific tools and platforms you can use. So there's at least like 5 or 6 different things in what we would call the Google ecosystem of like tools that you can use. Some of them are a little bit more user-friendly for lay people. The top one I would recommend if you're a beginner or this is like you're unfamiliar with this is the PageSpeed Insights tool. You could just in a Google bar type in PageSpeed Insights and it's going to give you the link for that and take you to the tool. And then all you do is it's like a bar. It says enter in the URL. So you copy and paste the address of your home page or whatever pages you want to test. You click enter. You see the little boop, 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 progress bar, and then it's going to spit out like an actual like report for you. Okay. It will report on LCP, FID, and CLS. So you'll see that most of these tools will like provide detailed information specifically about that. There are 2 exceptions. If you're using Chrome developer tools or Lighthouse, which is a developer platform that's put out by Google, it's on their developers.google.com subdomain. They don't provide specifically a first input delay. I turn that off. First input delay metric, but they have what's called time to first, total blocking time, TBT, and it's a very equivalent metric. Okay. They highly correlate, okay? So there's a little bit of differences there, but PageSpeed Insight's your best bet if you're not a web developer. There's also a Chrome UX report, which is basically leveraging, again, it updates monthly. They've spit out, here's the data we've seen from all live in the wild Chrome web sessions for not just your vertical, but all verticals. And they now have an API that you can tie that in. So I know that we're very big on tools. We have our own like business intelligence dashboard solutions that we use. So if you were using like APIs in other contexts, Chrome UX report, or they call it Crux, the shortened version of it, Crux report, is going to be available to you for API. Google Search Console is a free solution or platform that you can sign up for. They give you basically a snippet of code, you put it in your website, and it provides you not just information about this, but it's going to give you a whole bunch of great SEO information. What pages Google's crawling, what they've discovered, what they haven't discovered, how fast your pages load, what do you rank for, where do people go.
Right.
They give you a lot of information. It's a little similar to analytics, but it's really tailored to, again, Google search as like a product. So PageSpeed Insights and Search Console, I would say, are the two most user-friendly ones. Chrome UX, you kind of know, you need to know how to leverage an API. Chrome Developer Tools, that's if you're using Chrome, just go into your right upper corner, like the options, and anybody can actually access Chrome Developer Tools. It's a built-in feature for Chrome, right? Our web development team uses it all the time. Lighthouse is a specific place you can go. Again, it's I would call a platform. Lighthouse is on the developers.google.com. It's built off of the same kind of fundamental technology stack, and it provides a lot of the same data in just a slightly different visual fashion. And then there's actually a Web Vitals extension. You can get this for Chrome, and you can get it for other browsers. It's a plugin. If anyone has ever used like a browser plugin that you're on a web page and you can click and it does something, it analyzes the web page in some sort of meaningful way, there's a specific plugin that you can get that if you're on a page, you can click it and it'll spit out these scores. So there's all the Google ones, and again, I think that's the best place to get it because this is a kind of Google focus, but there are other tools that will provide you similar levels of data. GT Metrics, Pingdom are the two really popular ones among developers. If people are using other types of crawling solutions like Sitebulb or Siteimprove, those are two ones you can use as well. This is a screenshot from Lighthouse. So it kind of even shows you like it's a scoring calculator. So you can see all the metrics that they're looking at, and they give you like a slider that lets you pick or like, all right, how fast is your LCP? How fast is your total blocking time? And you can slide it up or down, and you can see like in that scenario how the scores would change, right?
Oh, that's cool.
So they give you like an example, like they start at a 50, and there's like a hypothetical page, right? And they show you the weighting. So again, I mentioned that like they're not all weighted equally. You'll see that total blocking time and LCP are like 30 and 25% of the weight, whereas CLS, it's 10%. So again, they're not all equally weighted, but based on your actual results, if you were to predict I saved 100 milliseconds on my interactive, you can slide the bar up or down, and you're going to get a spit out new metric of like what that might look like. So that's the Lighthouse scoring calculator if you were to use particularly like Lighthouse. And I like to use that for like planning purposes. Like again, like here's where we are, here's where we need to go, and how can we achieve that fundamental score jump? Because there's a few different ways depending what sliders we start playing with, right? Common issues to solve for. The main ingredients of a web page, even in like 2021, I mean, it boils down typically to like 4 main ingredients. You have HTML, and that's like, you know, every web page starts with an actual core HTML file. It's the blueprint for your web page, and it's going to tell the browser, like, here's how you assemble this web page. It provides the structure and lists the required pieces to create the web page. Then you have CSS. CSS came after HTML. It's cascading style sheets. Web developers use this to separate form from function, right? It creates the colors, the fonts, the shading. Are you using rounded edges for your table, or is it a flat square edge? All the visual elements that don't really have anything to do with the actual words or content on the page are like style sheets. And then you have JavaScript. And JavaScript is basically, it embeds functionality, or like it lets you do interactive things. So JavaScript might be like Google Analytics code that's like helping you get raw data, or like sliders, image carousels. When you click the next one, or a read more, and it opens up an accordion of content. That's JavaScript. So JavaScript provides extra functionality that HTML alone can't do. And then you've got like the spice. Well, that's your actual multimedia files, right? Typically you're loading images, video, or maybe audio in addition to just words on a page, right? Good websites should never just be text. You're going to need something else in there visually compelling. So that's all the multimedia assets. The common issues to solve for are basically figuring out like, well, which pieces are like big and bloaty that are causing like bottlenecks typically. This is a screenshot from GTmetrix, and this is called a waterfall chart. When you're loading a web page, what you're actually doing is you're making a request to the server dozens to maybe like over 100 different times saying, I need this piece, I need this piece, I need this piece, right? For a browser to assemble a page, it makes dozens of those unique requests to the host server. And sometimes the HTML says, actually, this file is located on another server, on a third-party website or domain, right? These requests are sequential typically, meaning the prior requests have to be completed before you can move on to the next request. So in this example, you can see like there's a whole bunch of, on the left, it's just a column of like files or assets as we would call them. To the right, you can see that there's these different sized bars. The wider the bar, that's actually measuring milliseconds, how long it took to request that asset and then the server to send it back to you and for you to fully download it. So the big takeaway is like, well, what's that really big wide purple bar? Yeah, that's exactly what that a waterfall chart will help you identify, right? The number of requests that you're making, their actual order or flow can all impact how a page loads. And individual file sizes are all going to impact like how a page loads. So here's a tale of like 2 pages. This is from a different tool that I use, but it like lets me very quickly figure out what's going on. I take the page and I run it through the tool, and the first thing on the left is just a meter of like, what's the total page size? And in this example, it's over 11 megabytes, which I can tell you is a humongous web page, right? It's going to be very difficult to load that in a phone. And when I look to the right, it shows me in a donut chart, out of those 11 megabytes, what is constituting this, all right? And I can see that JavaScript and images are making up like 80% of the page load or more. And the actual HTML and CSS are very like minimal, right? So this web page is quite large, and we can see half the page load is JavaScript and like images. Then we have another one, and it's like, all right, this page is much smaller. It's a little over 4 megabytes, right? JS still represents share-wise the largest share of it, but we can see now that the amount that comes from images is like much less, smaller, right? So you kind of need to know, and the tools, when they spit out suggestions, they're almost always framed in terms of like, you need to compress your images, or you need to resize your images, or maybe you need to reformat your images. We recommend JPEG as a general default if you don't know what type of image type to use. Consider JPEG. PNGs and other images that are a little bit larger in size, they are higher quality, but you want to make sure you have an appropriate use case for using them because they do tend to be a little bit like larger, okay? Same thing with like JavaScript. It tends to be a little, I call it bloaty. Your code can very quickly, especially if you're using multiple JavaScript-driven features or functions or elements, it's very quickly going to lead to increased file sizes. So the common issues to solve for in our experience is if it's an LCP issue, it's typically JavaScript or CSS bloat. You may have files you don't need that you can like defer or just simply remove. It could be multimedia files. It could be the total number of page requests. Some pages load with only like 20 requests, 50 requests. Other ones take over 100 different requests to fully load the page, right? So also the order and flow of those requests. Again, if one thing is presenting a bottleneck, it doesn't matter how quick those other items after it may load if that's being bottlenecked right now. So for LCP, that's typically where we look. I would say JavaScript and multimedia are the main areas of opportunity. For first input delay, it's typically your JavaScript execution. Again, especially if it's something like you click and it's a read more, or it's some sort of interactive thing that you're trying to do, like on that Lighthouse calculator. For me to actually slide the sliders, that requires JavaScript. So if there's interactivity delays, it's probably something related to JavaScript. It might also, again, be your order or flow of requests. And then for CLS, it's almost always your CSS, how it's actually arranged or coded. It could be total page requests, and it could also be, again, your multimedia image files. If they don't have height or width attributes, sometimes that can throw the browser for like a loop as it determines how big it actually needs to be.
So looking at the time, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we get to sort of this homework assignment, if you will, for everybody, and just maybe a question or two. So I don't know how much is left, Dan, but just as point. We have 5 minutes left, so just with that, we can pick it up from wherever you want.
Yeah, let's talk about actionable next step. I'll jump back and then, if
Okay.
we have time, we can do what can't tools tell you.
Okay.
The what can't tools tell is going to tell you is like get in contact with a web developer. All of you have somewhere at your organizations a stakeholder. Even if you outsource this, well, we use this agency or this company and they do our web development. Ask them if they're familiar with Core Web Vitals and say like, I took a presentation on this and it's new to us, but it's something that we're going to emphasize. A web developer is going to be your best asset beyond just a tool, because a tool is just a cold, it has no actual context for your specific website. So you need to have a web developer to tell you like what's readily actionable based on our website. What changes are going to take like more heavy lifting and require more resources, right? What changes may require a more extensive website redesign? For some clients or websites, it might make more sense to just redesign something from the ground up rather than to constantly tweak something that was built years ago in some cases, all right? So contact web developers. If you don't have a web developer, you're unfamiliar, we have an in-house web developer team, and they can provide like actual context to what these tools are telling you. But I would say for your homework, especially if you want to participate in the roundtables, is Google that PageSpeed Insights tool and use it quickly to test your homepage. And then I want you to find 3 to 5 of your other most important page types. Maybe it's your services or it's your products. It could be your About Us. Maybe your blog does particularly well in generating leads. You know better than anyone like what drives meaningful traffic to your website. So grab those, sample 2 or 3 representative pages per page type if you can. Again, because you will see some slight variation. So the more you can audit and like representatively sample, the better an idea you're gonna get. And then what I want you to do is audit the homepage and the top pages for 3 to 5 of your top competitors. Do the same exact exercise, their homepage and their service page, or 2 or 3 of their service pages. And then jot down the scores and see how they compare and see like where you are alongside your competition. You may be ahead of them. You may be behind them. You may be right in the midst, and everyone is just figuring this out as we like go along. And then again, identify internal or external team members that can guide this process. Digital marketing professionals obviously will become a little bit more familiar with this, but SEOs and web developers are typically the 2 places you can turn to that are at least conversant on this topic, all right? And the other thing I want to emphasize is like, these are not pass-fail tests, right? It's like, as long as you can move a point forward, like better is better. So it really, again, comes down to like, what resources do you have? And at what point do you start to hit a wall on, well, with additional resources, we're just not seeing as much gains as we were earlier in this process. I'd say get ahead of this now. Again, my advice to most people is take the carrot now and avoid the stick in 12 to 24 months. Again, solving for this does improve like your UX and your conversion rates across the board. This isn't just like a Google, again, I'm an SEO, always just emphasizing it for organic search. What works for this is going to work for all of your channels. And I promise you the ROI is there. You just need to prioritize and budget this into your kind of general digital marketing strategies if it's something that really needs remediation. So do we have time for 1 or 2 other questions?
Yeah, I think we do. There was one that I'm just looking here. Sorry for, if you guys can see me on the camera, I'm looking at my computer. I'm just fielding the questions. There was one question about WebP images. That might make sense to you. It doesn't make as much sense to me.
WebP is a new image format. It basically is like, it combines the best of both worlds with a JPEG and a PNG. I mentioned like JPEG is kind of like a default file type. It's a little bit smaller in size. PNG offers you like it supports transparency. It's a lossless image. WebP is a new format that you can basically upload your files, and they kind of deliver very, very, very fast. Chrome is behind it. I believe Firefox is behind it. And I know Edge supports it, I'm pretty sure, as well. I think there's a holdout, and I think it's Safari. I will have better answers by the roundtable, but I'm almost positive Safari doesn't support WebP yet. So if you have WebP as an option for your image delivery, I would certainly say, yes, consider it, but you may need in your code to provide an alternative location or image asset specifically for Safari browsers.
Okay.
So you look in your analytics, you can kind of see like what your actual users are using for operating systems. And if you're like, a lifestyle brand for upper income demographics, you're probably going to have more Apple users, right? Because it's a little bit more costly of a product. if Apple doesn't constitute a significant large of your traffic, WebP is definitely, it solves for a lot of these issues.
Okay. All right. Another question is, we're building a site, or, is there a better CMS that would lend itself to, a better, core web vital score, if you will?
I would say in general, Google is kind of like agnostic to your particular content management system. Like it doesn't really look at like, oh, you're a Wix site versus a Squarespace site, and we don't like Wix or we don't like Squarespace. It doesn't really like work like that. In my experience, like things like Wix and Squarespace, they're equally like website builders than they are like content management systems. They're designed for audiences, particularly small business owners who do not have web development or design skills. So they allow you to like drag and drop and like make a website, but they don't always offer you the ability to customize and really dive into the code. So you may find when you're actually trying to like tinker with JavaScript, if you're in Squarespace or Wix, your ability to do that may be limited, particularly if you're a beginner. There's always like, if there's a will, there's a way, and you can always like, oh, we can modify the PHP config file. You're gonna need a web developer for that. We're a WordPress house internally at Overit, so we always like love WordPress, but WordPress really fundamentally isn't any better or worse. But if you're choosing one, I would say go to WordPress just because it's widely supported. It's the most common content management system, and it is the best user base and developer base compared to any other product. And it's free for the most part.
All right. So then I think at this point in time, we will wrap this up. So I want to thank everybody that tuned in on one of the streams here. I want to thank also Dan for putting this together and taking us through a lot of this. As I think you guys can appreciate, this is very important. And like we mentioned, if Google is telling us now that it's important, most likely it'll be less of a suggestion, more of a mandate. So we suggest you get ahead of it now. One of the great things about Overit webinars is we always follow it up with a roundtable that gives you some time to digest the information you just heard and bring questions to have more of a roundtable. So go and do your homework. Go check out your site, some of your pages. Look at some of your competition, see how you fare, see how you compare, and then bring back some of the information you found to the roundtable, which you'll get an email about, and we'll be happy to walk you through and talk you through some of the results. So again, thanks for joining it, Dan. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to Dave and Katie and Mitch and everyone on our production team
Overit
as well
Studios.
for helping put it together.
Thank you,
Overit
guys.
Studios. Thanks, guys.